so we need to think about the tools that we need in addition to what we're going to get in the box, which is pretty much the paints, the glue and a brush. So this is all stuff that you'll be able to find around the house. So first of all, you'll notice I'm using a cutting mat, and if this is your first model kit or you're just starting into modelling, it's unlikely that you'll have a cutting mat, but you can make yourself one. Get yourself a bit of cardboard, a bit of empty packaging, a pizza box, whatever it is. Cut yourself out a double thickness of fairly thick cardboard, and you can use that for cutting on so that the work surface or the table or wherever it is you're working doesn't get damaged. I'd also recommend putting some newspaper down or something like that so that when you're painting and gluing and stuff, the work surface is protected. So newspaper, old magazine, whatever you can find, or just more cardboard. Make sure that you've got your surface covered. As you can see, I have a cutting mat and I also have a protective cloth because I'm actually on the kitchen table myself. Okay, so that's the first thing. We need some form of cutting mat. Second thing is you're going to need some way of taking the parts off the sprue. Now, I'm going to be using this craft knife. So I'd normally use cutters, but we're not going to do that for this build because this is an entry-level build. So if you've not got a craft knife or someone in your family's not got a craft knife, then the retractable sort of case cutting knives or a Stanley knife, they all could do the job, or even a pair of nail scissors, whatever you can find that will cut the parts off the sprue. So that's what we're looking for, some form of knife. Now you're also going to need a file. So this is an emery board. You can buy it in supermarkets. That also commonly used for as nail files. So if you're a youngster, ask your mum about getting an emery board that's not too coarse, and that will be used for sanding the parts and getting them smooth. So that's those. A pair of tweezers may well be handy. Get the finest point you can get. I'm using some quite chunky ones here just so that we're sort of keeping in the vein of what you're likely to be able to find. Bottle top or bottle tops. This is a milk bottle top. We'll be using this for putting our glue in. So getting several of those is handy if you can, but at least get one. You're going to need a little jar of water for washing your paintbrush and thinning your paints. So ideally one with a lid so that you can seal it up and we don't have any accidents. You're also going to need some pegs. So these will be used to clamp some of the parts together possibly. So that's what we're going to do. So 4 to 6 clothes pegs. Cocktail sticks. Probably got some knocking around in the house somewhere. If you haven't, then they can be bought in supermarkets and they're very, very cheap. So get yourself some cocktail sticks because we're going to use those for applying our glue and mixing our paints. And you're going to need some form of tissue paper to wipe your brushes and wipe up any spills and blot your decals. And you're also going to need some form of tray for soaking your decals. So you could even get away with the lid off a Tupperware box or something like that. It doesn't have to be particularly deep, or a saucer. Now I'm going to be using a paint palette. If you've not got a paint palette, then bottle tops is a good solution. There you go. That is tools we're going to need for building our first model kit. Right then, let's introduce you to the model kit so that you're familiar with some of the things we're going to talk about as we go. So let's take a look inside. They're usually taped down. So we have a bag with our paints in. Our paintbrush, our model parts, and our instructions. So let's start with the paintbrush. The paintbrush will be a bit hard on the tip to start with. So what I recommend you doing is a little bit of washing up liquid, rub it in your fingers, massage it into the bristles, and then run it under the tap. Now if this has come off the little protective cover and the bristles have got bent, then just doing that will straighten out these bristles and get it back into a condition ready for use. So that's our paintbrush. So we can open our bag and take out our paints and glue, and we can throw that away. Now the paints should have a number either printed on a piece of paper on the top, there, you can see that one very easily, 145, or printed on the side, 33. So that's our 4 paints, and then we have a tube of poly cement, which is the glue we're going to use, and you must keep the lid on all the time that you're not using it. So that's our contents. Now you'll see that some of these lids are just, there's a little cut out in them, which is where you get your finger underneath to prise it off. There you go, and you can see we've got an amount of quite thick paint in there, and then some of them have this little hinge on. Now if you've got the little hinge on it, then you need to cut this off, or ask a grown-up to cut it off, because this gets in the way of the paint lid working properly. It can cause a mess, and it can cause your paint pot to fall over. So cut that hinge off, and then you can just take the paint pot lid off like the others. So that's those bits prepared. Let's next have a look at the parts. So what we've got is the parts on a frame, and the frame is called a sprue. So you'll hear me throughout the build calling it a sprue. And basically the frame is a sprue, the little bit that comes off the frame is a stage, and the small bit that connects to the part is a gate. And when we cut a part off and there's a little bit left over, that's a nub. That's the terminology that I'll be using, and you'll find that the sprue has a letter that associates it to identify all these parts, and then the individual parts have got a number. So this says sprue B, and then each little part has a number. Now, tucked inside the instructions, we have our decals. Now, these are the markings that we're going to put on the aeroplane. They float off with water, and then when they dry, they'll stick to the surface of your model. They're not stickers, they're not sticky back, they've not got adhesive on. They're water slide. So we can put those to one side as well. Keep hold of the box, because we will use the box in the build as we get a little bit further down. So don't get rid of your box, and your paint instructions are on the back of the box. So we've got our paint numbers there, and each colour is referenced on the back of the box somewhere, so we know what to paint everything. So keep hold of that, and then we have our instructions. Now, one of the most important things when you're building a model is to keep the space that you're working on as tidy as possible. If you're untidy, what will happen is the space that you're working on will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you end up working in a very confined space, and that's when accidents happen. Okay, so the first thing that it says is for best results, surfaces to be painted should be clean. Before parts are removed from the sprue, wash in warm soapy water, rinse and dry thoroughly, stir paints thoroughly before use. So the first thing we're going to do is wash them. So a little bit of warm water with a bit of washing up liquid, just get them a little bit soapy, run your fingers over them, rinse it off under the tap, let them air dry. So the next thing we need to do is get familiar with the instructions, and on the bottom of page 2 we have a little assembly icon instruction section, and basically these symbols will be used throughout the instructions and they all mean something. So it tells you if it's an option, if you've got to drill something, that you've got to put a weight on something, that you need to make more than one set. So they all mean something different. So just read yourself through that so that you're familiar with it, and then when you've done that you can turn to the first step and we can start building. So step 1 is asking us to put these parts together to build up the inside of the cockpit. So we've got a letter and a number in a circle, which refers to the part number. So if you remember, the sprue is the letter and the number is the part, so A20, and we'll find that, which is the control stick for the aeroplane. B11 is the pedals, B12 is the seat, and B10 is the cockpit floor. These numbers that are not in a circle, they refer to our paints, and so it's asking us to paint these before we glue them into place, and the arrows just show us where they go in, and you can see there's a little dotted picture which shows you where you're placing them on the inside. And when you've done that, we move to the next stage, which is putting the pilot in, putting the dials in, and using the first decals. So let's start with number 1. Identify your parts and then we'll cut them out with a knife. So we need our cutting mat, we need our knife, and we need to find sprue B and sprue A. So this is sprue B, and this is the cockpit bottom that we need to cut out, and you'll see where the sprue connects is where we need to cut. Now, because we're cutting with a knife, what we want to do is get the knife as close to the flat surface of your work desk as possible, and cut, leaving a bit of distance between the end of the part and where the sprue finishes. So you can see that the part ends here, but we're going to cut about here. And then I'm going to turn it over and we're going to cut again a little bit further away from the part. There we go. Now you can see why we have used the cardboard, because it stops any damage to the table. So that's our first part cut off, and what we need to do is just trim that up. So using the knife, we want to get as close as we can to that flat surface and just trim it down, and do the same again with this. As close as you can. If you're uncertain, leave a little bit of space so that you can then file down the last little bit. So you can see there's a little bit left on the end there, we call that the nub, and we just need to take our emery board and just sand that nice and flat so that there's only the part left. So use the coarsest side of your emery board. Now it's important that you get all of the nub off, because if you don't, you might find that the part doesn't fit properly when you try and glue it into the aeroplane. And we can do the same at the front, where we cut that other bit of nub off and just make it sure that it's nice and flat. So there we go, that is the first part off. So I'll cut the rest of the parts off. We're going to do exactly the same with those, and when they're all cut off, I'll come back to you. Now from time to time you might find that you have little parts where it's very difficult to get in and clean off the nubs. So this seat is a case in point. There's a little cutout and I can't get my emery board in. Now if you're confident with the knife and you've got a craft knife that's small enough, you can get in there and just gently cut it back so that it's gone. But if you've not, or you've not got a knife that's small enough to go in, or you're not confident to do that, then what we can do is cut a little bit off our emery board to make a small sanding board. So let's do that. So all we're going to do to make a small sander is get a pair of scissors, and we're first going to cut the little round, half round end off. Don't throw that away because we can use that for sanding as well. And then we're going to cut a little strip off, just as wide as we think we need, so that we have a small little sanding stick that can get into those little tight places. I can get into that little gap there that I couldn't get into before and just sand away that little nub. So I'm happy that the part is nice and smooth. And take your time. Get it right. So we're now ready to glue our first parts in. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the top off our little tube of glue and put a small spot of glue in the bottle top, and then put that top straight back on the glue so it's not leaking out. Then we're going to use a cocktail stick to put the glue on where we want it. So let's start with the seat. Now, so that you know what you're doing before you glue it into place, you should practice fit it. It's called dry fitting because there's no glue, so the part is dry. And we just want to put that in place and be comfortable that we know where it goes. Once we're fairly comfortable that we know where it goes, we can put the glue on it. So in this instance, we're going to put a small amount of glue on this raised area here, which is where we're going to put our part. So the secret is to put as little glue on as you can get away with. So the next part we're going to put in is these pedals. And again, we're just going to dry fit it and make sure that we're happy we know how it fits. And I think we might be better fitting it with the tweezers. There we go. So I can see where that goes now. So what we're going to do is put some glue on the underneath of that part, and I'm going to use the tweezers to hold it while I do that. Okay, so that's my pedals in now. And then finally we've got this joystick. Now the joystick is going to be painted the same colour as the interior, but we can paint the bottom and the top a different colour if we wish. Now I think in this first instance what we're going to do is just paint the handle a different colour. So a little bit of glue on the bottom, and we can place that in a little hole in the floor there. So that is our first stage done. We're going to let that dry so that we can paint it. Now when we look at the next step, we're putting in this piece here where we put all the dials on, and that is painted in the same colour 145 that we're painting those. So we can clean that up and paint that at the same time before we glue it in. So let's do that. Okay, that part is now ready for painting, but our glue is still not dry on there. So let's have a look at step 3. Now step 3 has the 2 fuselage halves, but if you look at it you can see the instructions are telling us to paint the inside in this 145 colour. So we can take these parts off and clean them up and paint the inside of these at the same time as we paint those. So let's do that. Things we must always check for as we're cleaning our parts up with our emery board is any plastic that sort of leaked out of the mould when it was made. So you can see there's some here and we call that flash. So we just need to make sure that we've sanded away any flash so that the part is nice and crisp as it was intended to be. And we can now just test fit our parts and make sure everything fits okay before we paint it, and it looks like this is all going to fit together quite nicely actually. Paint, and one of the little tricks that I learned when I was quite young was that blue tack was a really good way of holding parts so that they don't move when you're painting them. So this part, for example, we want it to be painted all over, so there's nowhere I can actually hold it while I'm painting it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of blue tack and we're going to put the part on the blue tack, and that'll just hold there while we're painting. And we will do that with all of these parts. So the next thing we need to do is get the paint ready for painting. And we're going to do that by first giving the paint a little bit of a shake. And then when we've given it a shake, we're going to open the lid. And we're going to take a cocktail stick and put some of the paint into your bottle top or palette if you've got one. Not too much, you can always come back for more. And you can see I've taken the paint out of the top. There we go. So I have a small amount of paint. I put my top back on to stop the paint going dry. And then I'm going to take my paintbrush and get it wet. and then I'm going to mix the paint with my wet paintbrush, and doing that just thins the paint a little bit. And then we're going to do it again. And then I recommend taking some tissue paper and taking most of the paint off your paintbrush. And when we're painting, we want to just dip the end of the paintbrush in. We don't want paint all the way up the top of the bristles. We just want it on the bottom end of the bristles. Then we can paint our parts knowing that we're not going to have too much paint coming off the brush. Now we might need to do more than one coat of paint. And the trick is to take your time, get into all the little corners, the nooks and the crannies, and make sure that you've got everything painted that should be painted. So if your paint starts to go a little bit thick because it's drying out a little bit, just get your brush wet again and give it a mix in the paint, and that will just thin it down. It's better to put 2 or 3 thin coats on than 1 thick coat. That way you won't get any brush strokes showing in the paint. So I'm going to give all of these parts now a second coat, and then I'll come back to you when that's done. You've finished painting, give your paintbrush a good swirl around in the water and wipe it on your tissue paper. You might need to do it a couple of times. And if you have managed to get paint at the top of your bristles, then it's best to go and put a little bit of washing up liquid on it, massage the bristles to get the paint out, and then run it under the tap until it's clear. You might need to do that 2, maybe even 3 times. Now you need to change your water and get some clean water, and if you're using a palette or a paint or a bottle top, while the paint's still wet, give it a wash and get rid of all that paint. We can wash it out with water. Now in step 2 we also have a pilot, so if you want to put a pilot in your aeroplane, now's the time to cut your pilot out, clean him up and paint him while the paint is drying on the parts you've made in step 1. So it says to paint it in 27, which is that paint pot there. So let's get him cleaned up and then we can give him some paint too. So I've cut my pilot off and I gave him a little bit of a sand, and now what I've done is I've put his bum on this bit of blue tack, so now I can hold the blue tack and paint the pilot and get in all the places I need to with my paintbrush. Now if you look at the paint you can see that there's black in there and there's the paint colour in there, so the paint isn't very well mixed. So what we're going to have to do is mix the paint. So I'm going to use my paintbrush and just push this paint that's in the lid back into the bottle. That means we're mixing as much paint as we can when we mix everything up. Get the excess paint off the paintbrush, and we've got some paint here on the lid, so I just want to clean that off as well, and it'll just stop the lid sticking to the paint pot. I think we'll throw that in the bin and get a clean one. Right, using our cocktail stick, we're going to give the paint a stir, making sure the cocktail stick's right down to the bottom. And we're just going to keep stirring it until it's all one uniform colour and there's no thick lumps in the paint. Now that paint is too thick to paint, so we will have to thin it with a little bit of water. So we'll take a good blob of paint and just take the paint off the cocktail stick with the wet brush, and then put the cocktail stick somewhere where we're not going to get paint everywhere. So I'm actually going to put mine on a little bit of tissue paper. I know that's out of the way and not causing any problems. Right, let's give that a mix. That's still too thick. So we're just going to keep adding a little bit of water until the paint doesn't feel stiff to move around. It should be like, it should run freely back into the centre when I draw it up the top there. So some people say like the thickness of milk, but milk comes in different thicknesses, so I'm not sure how good a guide that is. It's something that just comes with a little bit of experience of doing more models, but you want it not too thin so that you can't see through it, but if it is a little bit thin, that's okay. Let it dry and then give it another coat. Okay, so we need to clean the excess paint off the brush. Now once you've been making a few models, you'll get some additional paints, and you could buy a skin coloured paint and paint his face a different colour, and you could paint his boots in a leather brown, and his hands in a skin colour, and his harness in a different colour. But for this first model, we're just going to paint the pilot all one colour as the instructions tell us. That's our pilot painted, and we can leave him to dry too. You can leave that paint for 20 minutes or so, and if your pilot's dry, you can put some more water in there, thin it, make the paint come alive again, and give it a second coat. I think I've put enough paint on there that I won't need to give it a second coat, so I'm going to wash all this up. Now the paint is dry on our little part here, we're ready to put the decals on. So that's decal number 1 and decal number 2, which need to be added onto here. So let's do that. First of all, you need to find the decals on your decal sheet. So there they are, 1 and 2 there. And I'm just going to cut them out with a pair of scissors. And we can put the rest of the decals well out of the way of the water. So you can see I've got a little tray of water here. So that's ready to go. And we're going to need our tweezers. Now, on the decal sheet above each decal is a little number. And what we don't want to do is put that in the water, because that will float off and it might get stuck on our decal. So the next thing I'm going to do is cut the decals in half so that we've got 2 separate decals, number 1 and number 2. And then we'll cut the number off number 1. And throw that away. And then the decal we place carefully with our tweezers, and if you've not got tweezers, just with your fingers, place it in the water with the decal facing up. You might find that the paper that the decal is on just curls up a little bit, that's fine, and if it sinks into the water, that's fine, don't worry about it, just leave it for a few minutes. Now, as you watch that, you'll see that the paper initially curls up and then it flattens out again, and that's because the water is starting to soak into the paper, which is what we want, because that's going to allow the decal to lift off. So we'll just give it a few moments, and while that soaks, I can cut the number off decal number 2. So after it's been in the water for a moment or two, we can lift it out, and then what I like to do is just rub my thumb, put my thumb on the decal and move my thumb around, and if I can see the decal's moving, I know it's ready to come off. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the decal to the edge of the paper so that it's slightly overhanging, and then we go to our part and we get the decal on the edge of the part where we want it, put our finger on it and slowly pull the paper out. Now, I've made that look easy. It might be a little bit tricky. Now, one of the things you can do is get your tweezers wet and just put, or your finger, and put a little bit of water on it. If the decal's not in quite the right place, you can move it around. We call it refloating. So that's just putting some water on so that the decal is basically sitting on the water rather than sitting on the part. Once you're happy it's in the right place, take a little bit of paper and gently press down on it, and what that will do is take any excess water out and then just leave it to dry. Now that first one's on, we can get the second one in the water, and we can do exactly the same with that, and that'll give us a really cool looking dashboard. So there is our instrument panel with its two decals on. Now don't worry if you struggled and found that a bit difficult and they didn't go on properly. You will improve the more you do it, and you've got plenty of practice coming with some more decals later on. This will not be seen very easily, so it doesn't matter if you don't put the decals on here. The part we need to think about in step 2 is this little part here, D2, and D is our clear sprue, and it's this tiny little part here. So we're going to take that off in the same way as we did before. Now you could attempt to paint this black, or you could just leave it clear, and I think what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is just leave it clear. So we'll put a tiny little bit of glue right on that little end there like that, and glue it onto our dashboard before we put it into the cockpit. Now, if you think that's going to be a little bit tricky, by all means leave it off. So we can now finish off step 2 by gluing our pilot into his seat, and I'm just putting a little bit of glue on his bum so we can sit him on his chair. There we go. So that's our pilot. And then the dashboard goes into the two little slots on each side. So let's just test that we can put that in okay. Yep, that goes in great. No problems. In fact, it's so tight, it's a little difficult to get it back out. And we're going to put a little bit of glue just on the inside of each one of those little gaps. So when we push the part in, it just sticks there and we know it's not coming back out again. So that is step 2 finished. So we need to paint this part black, and the instructions tell you the whole part is black, but actually you're only going to see these little bits here, so we don't have to paint the whole thing black. So I'm just going to paint these end bits where we know it'll be black, and this will take more than one coat paint. And we can also paint the top of the control stick at the same time. Okay, so we are now ready to assemble the parts in step 3. So we're going to need a bit more glue than we've used before, so we'll put a little bit out. We can always put some more in if we need it, so don't overdo it. And we're going to start by putting these exhausts in. So we're going to glue it into that first side. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the bit of part that we know is going to make contact. There we go. And then the next thing we need to do is get that into there. Now it looks on the instructions like it sits on the top of the little line there. So we just want to dry fit it and make sure we know how it's going in. Okay, so we can put some glue along this edge here and down here and along that edge there, and we'll put some on that dashboardy bit. Now none of this will really be visible, so don't worry if you've got a little bit too much glue on, but try your best to put just enough on. Okay, now this glue is reasonably slow drying, which is good because what we want to do now is put the other half of the fuselage on. So we're going to put glue on these edges here, and some on the tail, but don't put too much on because this glue can actually melt the plastic if you put too much on, and we don't want to spoil your model when you're doing so well. So we're just putting it on all the edges that we know are going to make contact. Now there is not as many as you would think. There we go. And we can also put some glue on this bit of cockpit as well. The more things that get glued together, the stronger the part the aeroplane is going to be. Now this is the point where we might need some pegs. Right, I think we've got enough glue on. So I'm going to very carefully line up the front first, and then the tail and the location pins. So I'm going to put a peg on the tail, which will hold that together while I'm pressing together the rest of it. And we need to make sure that that part that with the exhausts on is straight so that it doesn't get in the way of the parts going together. And it's not straight at the minute, but it is now. I'll put another peg there just to hold it together. It's a little tricky, if I'm honest. So don't worry if you're struggling a little bit too, because I've built lots of models and I'm finding this a bit tricky. There we go. Right. And I would leave that for a good hour, let it all dry. And whilst that's drying, we can have a look at step 4. So in step 4 they show us that we can make some holes if we want to put the display stand on it. Well, it doesn't come with a display stand, and I don't think you can buy these display stands anymore. So we're going to have the wheels down and not use a display stand. It also wants us to drill some little holes here. So I'm going to drill holes in one wing, but if you don't have a small drill or don't know anyone that you can borrow a small drill from, then don't worry. I'm going to show you how we can attach the part that goes into those holes without having had to drill the holes. So let's start by drilling the holes. If you're going to drill the holes, just bear in mind that you're going to have to press down on the part. Now there's a bit of spring in it and you should be okay, but make sure that you do it on your little cutting mat so that you don't drill into the table. And what I like to do is go back through the hole from the other side, and that just cleans out all the little bits of swarf and make sure that you've got a nice, clean, smooth hole. And if needs be, just give it a little bit of a sand. Make sure you've got nothing there that's going to get in the way of the part being pushed into those holes. Brilliant. So the next thing we need to do is paint that. So we just need to clean the part up, and then we're ready for painting. So the other two parts in step 4 are the wing top and this small little part that fits into there. So I've cleaned that piece up, but I just wanted to show you the clean up of the lower part of the wing. Inside the wing we have these little round circles. They're called ejector pin marks, and that's where the tool was pushed out of the mould when it was being made. And some of them have a little bit of flash on, you can see there. And we need to remove that flash, and you can do that if you're confident with the knife and just trim it down. Or you can do it with your emery board, like so. But we need to get rid of it because it's going to get in the way of the two halves of the wings going together. And I think once you've cleaned up this part, it's worth trying the two parts together just to make sure they fit. So the part that goes in here sits on that little T shape. So we know we can put a little bit of glue on the top of that T, and that should be enough to hold this part in place. Just make sure you get it the right way round. It should sit down nice and flat on that part, leaving a little gap on the outside. So I've test fitted these and they fit really nicely. So we're going to have no problems with that at all. So the next thing we need to do is paint that, which is in our 145. So we're now moving to step 5, and that's the addition of these two parts which go here and here. Now the instructions tell you to paint these, which are actually machine guns that protrude out of the end there, black. But that's going to be very difficult to do once this is glued in, because it sits right on top of this part here. So I'm going to suggest that we glue this front part in and leave that off for now until we've painted the fuselage, and put it in and paint it separately later. So we'll put that part to one side and we'll glue this in, putting the glue just inside on these ledges here where the part sits, and then we'll leave it to dry. A little bit more experienced, you'll want to fill these little gaps and imperfections, but we're not going to worry about this as this is a beginner's build. What you can do though is just make sure that this ring at the front of the plane is nice and smooth. So you can do that with your sanding stick, or emery board I should say. Just get it nice and smooth. So in step 6 we have to glue in these parts that build up the tail, and these actually fit really tight. So if a part fits tight, it's always best to put the glue into the part that it's going into, so that you push the glue in rather than squeeze the glue out. So again, it's a matter of just not putting too much on. So I'm going to put a little bit in this hole, and then a little bit in this hole, and then we can just push the part into place. And you just have to make sure it's straight. If there's a bit of wobble in it, just straighten it while the glue dries. So it's not difficult. And don't worry if you get a little bit of glue where you don't want it. Don't try and rub it off, just leave it to dry. You might be able to sand it down afterwards. If this is your first model, expect to be making some mistakes, because mistakes is how we learn. And then on the tail, we're going to put some glue on the full length of the joining edge, because these tail pieces can be a little bit fragile. Okay, so that is step 6 done. Now while the glue dries on step 6, just making sure that's straight, we put that to one side and we can look at step 7, which is putting parts into these 2 holes. So once you have cut your parts off the sprue and given them a little sand to make sure that they're all nice and tidy, we just test fit them so we understand what we're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to put glue in this instance. We'll put glue underneath each one of those tabs and maybe a little bit on the inside edge so that it all glues in. That's in. I'll do the other one and then come back. So in step 8 we are putting in the cannons into the wings, and there's a little diagram there that shows you how they should look when they're done. The main thing is that the cannons are pretty much in a straight line, so you just have to study it carefully because there's 2 different types. There's one that has a sort of wedge shape end, and there's one with a circular end with a slot in it, and that slot goes over the little lump that's just inside the wheel bay there. So let's get those glued on. So putting the glue inside the little slot there and on the back surface. And then there's little openings in the wings that the cannon can rest in. Don't put any glue on those because it won't look as good, and there should be enough glue on the back where we've attached it to hold it in place. And then when we put the wing halves together, that will also help hold it in place. And then on these ones with the sort of the big wedge on the end, we'll put the glue straight on the wedge because that's going on the inside of the wing. Okay, so that's our cannons in. So we're now ready to put the 2 wings together, and we have to be a little bit careful here because what we don't want is lots of glue oozing out and ruining the shape of the wings. So I'm going to put the glue on the lower surface. That's the female half with the little holes in that pegs go into, and we'll start by putting a little bit of glue on the joining surfaces at the front there, and as always we're trying not to put too much on. And then when you get to the tip of the wing, you want to leave a millimetre or so. Just leave a little bit of an edge, like just so that when you push it down, the glue will squeeze, but not squeeze out of the end. We also want to put some glue on this, which is a connection point, along the edge of that flap there. Or we may well need to put some pegs on this while the glue dries, but that's okay. And just be mindful of where your part is going. You don't need to put glue on these parts because these parts are going on the aeroplane, not on the wing. So we're only putting glue where the wing is going to join. When you think you've got enough glue on, Bring the two halves together very carefully. I find just lining one end up first and holding that down and then just pushing it down along the full length make sure we've aligned it, and then we need to get our pegs. So one on the end, one between the cannons there, there, and one on the end. So once you've put your pegs on, just look round, see if you've got everything joined together nicely, and if not, put another peg on where it's not joining till both halves have come together. So the next job is to attach the wings to the aeroplane. So what we're going to do is put some glue on the aeroplane this time, and then we can push the wings in against it. So we're going to start by putting glue on all the mating surfaces at the front of the aeroplane. Okay, now the glue's on there, we can take the pegs off the wings. We'll put it in at the back. And then push it down into place. And if you think it needs it, you can always put some pegs on as well, just to be sure that it's held in place while it dries. There we go, we have something that looks like an aeroplane.